Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was just saying to, and thank you, Donna. I was just saying that it's hard to compete with Eleanor Roosevelt in the other room, so I really appreciate you coming to hear about the Federal Writers Project. And it's really an honor to be among all of these stellar authors today. I'm here mainly as an editor of this collection of essays on the Federal Writers Project, and I'm going to begin just by talking a little bit about the symposium that Donna referred to, which was last week, a week ago, on June 16th. Can you all hear me, by the way? Okay. Yeah. And it was titled Rewriting America, Reconsidering the FWP After 80 Years. And it was a one-day symposium that was really the culmination of so much research. And it speaks to the momentum that this New Deal project, this 80-year-old New Deal project, is having in our current culture, reflected in part by the publication of this collection late last year. And this event really, I think, helps put this volume into context and show the trajectory of this research, which was fueled, which I'm going to talk about, by many factors, including this shifting political and cultural landscape that we're in. So the Library of Congress event brought together scholars from across disciplines, a number of whom are included in this collection, to discuss the legacy of the FWP, as it is known, and to highlight the archival collection housed there. It is the main repository for documents on the FWP. I did not do my research here in this library. I did almost all of it at the Library of Congress. Over a decade ago, where I spent a lot of time in the archives sifting through the transcripts and interviews by many federal writers who I was discovering would go on to use the materials and techniques that they gleaned from their fieldwork in their post-war writing. So I'm coming entirely from a literary perspective. And I'll go into a little detail about the history of the FWP, which some of you might be a little bit familiar with. But just to be clear, the project was a New Deal program that sent thousands of unemployed workers out to document America during the Depression. It was only at full swing for a handful of years, but resulted in an extraordinary body of work, travel guides, interviews with former slaves, and transcripts from Americans of all walks of life, as well as reams of folklore and ethnographic essays. And as a student, and even as I was working on a book after graduate school, I felt a little as if I was kind of floating out there on my own. There were only a few histories of the program. There was Jerry Mangioni's first-person account called The Dream and the Deal from 1972, and Monty Penkower's The Federal Writers Project of Studying Government Patronage in the Arts in 1977, and then much, much later, in 2006, Gerald Hirsch, a cultural historian, published Portrait of America, which was, of course, invaluable to my work, as was David Taylor, who has spoken here, his journalistic account, Soul of a People, from 2009. But overall, I did not have a large body of work to draw on, and even my own advisor, the late Morris Dickstein, who's he passed away last year, highly regarded cultural and literary critic, who had written extensively on the 30s, had really limited knowledge of this program, which wasn't unusual at all at the time. So I only had a few places to go outside of the archives. The vast majority at that point were yet to be digitized. And as far as I knew, nobody had made a direct connection between the fieldwork and the literature that followed. So I really felt like I was treading new ground, which is, of course, exciting, but also scary because I didn't know what I would find. And fast forward, last week, there I am at the Library of Congress with Taylor and Hirsch and many other scholars who forged their paths in the archives, researching contributions by immigrant communities, folklore collected from children, new readings of the former slave narratives, and work that makes connections between the oral history performed by the FWP and many of our current initiatives happening around the country. The keynote address was delivered by Alessandro Portelli, who is a renowned oral historian who traveled from Italy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about him because he's his work is really relevant to this project as well. So like the volume here, the purpose of the symposium was really to consider the FWP not as a relic of the turbulent past, but as a program that really continues to reverberate in American culture, in our literature and our media and our public policy, and even in the ways that we have come to listen to and understand each other. And it is no accident that there's this surge of new scholarship on the FWP in recent years. It hasn't come out of nowhere. It's come out of the same forces that coalesced to create the Writers' Project in the first place. An economic crisis, political divisions, and of course, a looming sense of being in a country that is morally and culturally adrift. So the leaders and workers of the FWP were asking the question, who are we, and what does it mean to be American? And in recent years, of course, we're asking the same questions, and scholars across disciplines and journalists and writers are turning to the FWP and its infinitely rich, always surprising repository of material and techniques, practical and philosophical guidance. And we're still astonished by the fact that it even happened in the first place. W.H. Auden, the poet, now famously called it one of the noblest and most absurd undertakings ever attempted by any state. And it was. The program was largely dismissed as a kind of absurd throughout the 1950s, when it was considered old-fashioned idea from an idealistic era. And the 1960s saw a renewed interest, particularly in the collection of former slave narratives, which is the most extensive collection of first-hand accounts of slavery in existence, and the general mood in the 60s of looking at history from the bottom up. Then the FWP was ignored again throughout the 80s and 90s, as I note in the introduction, perhaps a reflection of both the Reagan and Clinton eras, which moved decidedly away from so-called big government, and also owing to the kind of academic preoccupation with postmodernism, against which the FWP's empirical approach and association with the political culture of the 30s no doubt seemed quaint. So then it resurfaced again, in part because of the crash of the 2008 crash, when a group of academics began to call for a new FWP in a climate of economic crisis and attacks from the right on funding for the humanities. And of course, we know that things only have gotten crazier since then, which we will allude to. So let me just offer some background about the Federal Writers Project. It is chiefly known today for the sweeping American Guide series, aimed at chronicling American cities, roadways, and history of towns, and 48 states it was done in. And for its collection of oral testimonies from former slaves, the last living generation of Americans born into slavery. There's also been a lot of attention directed at the project's volume of personal narratives, folklore, and some of which have been published in various forms since 1939, but a lot remains unpublished. A lot hasn't even been digitized. It's still tucked away in these archives on yellowing pieces of paper. The project was a small piece of the response to the Depression, and as part of the WPA, its immediate aim was to put people to work. Between 1935 and 1941, it hired nearly 7,000 unemployed Americans at a network of offices in 48 states. But like the other WPA arts projects, art, theater, and music, the FWP was also designed to fulfill a more far-sighted purpose, which was to create original new work that would both reflect the time of its production and outlive it. So federal writers were charged with generating this portrait of national identity, and one that echoed President Roosevelt's belief that Americans could connect to individual stories more than they could to speeches, facts, and figures. And as importantly, one that showed Americans the pluralist society that the country had become. Disturbed by the rising tide of fascism abroad, along with cries of nativism and growing anti-immigrant right-wing populism at home, the architects of the program felt an urgent need to affirm and celebrate the nation's cultural diversity. So they were called upon to transcribe and report on the real, quote-unquote, real America. Federal writers sought out their subjects everywhere and recorded, usually only with pen and paper or pencil and paper, what they heard and saw. And few of them were trained social scientists or journalists, but that was the point. They were ordinary Americans themselves, were, of course, victims of the Depression, like the people that they were documenting. And they were transcribing the voices of industrial workers, tenant farmers, housewives, immigrants, urban dwellers, artists, preachers, in short, America. Historians have long maintained that the politics and social policy during the Depression were shaped in part by Roosevelt's impulse to personalize the economic crisis through anecdotal evidence of its effects. In his now classic book, Documentary Expression and 30s America in 1973, William Stott argues that for Roosevelt, personal experience could illuminate the nation's crisis more than anything, more than theories or statistics, and his famous fireside chats and speeches peppered with testimonies suggest that in Roosevelt's worldview, quote unquote, people appear to have counted more than ideas. The intellectual left of the 1930s, for which Marxist determinism helped to explain the current state of affairs, naturally, they chafed against the president's reliance on personal stories rather than ideology. Stott writes, to most intellectuals of the 30s, everything personal was suspect, and Roosevelt moved cheerfully against this current of the time. So in many ways, the Federal Writers Project documentary form was a reification of Roosevelt's desire to project the nation through these individual voices. And in its attempt to conceptualize this pluralist collective identity, the project really stridently avoided scientific appraisals of American society, opting instead for these literary, they're very literary, renderings and first-person accounts. These slices of life and selections of regional folklore would not only offer Americans a record of their culture, but would also ideally help foster this mutual appreciation and expand previously narrow concepts of who qualified to be American. And whether this was naive or visionary, the FWP believed that exposure to Americans from poor and working class backgrounds would help to correct widely held misconceptions and propel integration into mainstream culture. So the project aired as never before, this is well before its time, the perspectives of communities of African Americans, of immigrants and the poor, and personalizing their larger realities by showcasing their voices became this critical element to the documentary form, which was the focus of my own study. Henry Ellsberg, who you may have heard of, was the director, and he was also a journalist and playwright. Sue DeMasi, who has spoken here before, has written a wonderful biography of Henry Ellsberg, published, I think, in 2016. And she's in this book as well, and there's a wonderful essay about him. And he also believed that putting federal writers face-to-face with Americans could serve to transform American writing. So not just help us understand each other as a diverse society, but also could actually change the kind of writing that was being done, particularly literary. And his aspirations were not far-fetched because the project hired most of the soon-to-be notable writers of that period, including Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, John Cheever, Arna Bontemps, Saul Bellow, Jack Conroy, Nelson Algren, Conrad Aiken, Margaret Walker, Dorothy West, Mae Swenson, Tilly Olson, Kenneth Patch, and Frank Yerby. The list goes on and on. In fact, it's such an extensive list that if there's a writer that wasn't part of the project from that period, it's surprising, because nearly everybody was. Although John Steinbeck he's often been associated with the project, but actually he never worked for the project, so there is one. So it offered not only a paycheck, but also this apprenticeship in documentary research and writing. And Ralph Ellison, for example, said he wouldn't have become a writer were it not for the project, which really launched his career. It also gave them this fountain of raw material, and this would prove very valuable in the post-war era as writers began to find new ways to articulate American culture and identity. Throughout the 40s and 50s, while historians were not talking about the FWP anymore, it was really living on in other ways, in the way that the FWP's obsession with trying to explain America to itself would bloom into something discernible in the literature. So the collectivist discourse of the 1930s fell away, and along with it a sense of optimism and progress engendered by the New Deal, yet the drive among writers to probe the character and quality of the country did not wane. Post-war writers continued to explore the lives of victims and outsiders and the struggles of so-called ethnic Americans. So in 1917, and based on my dissertation, I published Literary Legacies of the Federal Writers Project, which explores how the project influenced American literature, particularly through the work of Ellison, Margaret Walker, Dorothy Weston, Nelson Algren. And in it, I argue that by aiming their documentary lens so precisely on these individual voices, that FWP writers would ultimately eschew the social realism of 30s culture in favor of themes surrounding personal and cultural identity in the post-war era. So many previously marginalized writers, Black and women writers in particular, found their literary voices in part because of the project's efforts to create this grassroots methodology that privileged folklore, self-expression, and subjectivity, and that allowed emerging writers to claim their place in American culture. Of course, the FWP was not without its own biases, and it has come under much deserved criticism for the many distortions and racial stereotypes in some of its publications, where Black communities were portrayed as quaint or eccentric, primitive. There's a brilliant book from 2016, Long Past Slavery, representing race in the Federal Writers Project. Is the historian Catherine Stewart, who also joined us at the Symposium last week. She closely examines the complex interpersonal dynamic between those that interviewed the former slaves, most of whom were white Southerners, and the interviewees themselves, who employed what she describes as rhetorical strategies to negotiate the conditions of the interactions while speaking some level of the truth that they experienced. So, while recognizing the ways that the FWP was informed by cultural racism and Jim Crow, contemporary historians, including Stewart, also widely recognize the project for propelling forward the emerging field of Black history and for supporting Black writers. The FWP, of course, helped also create the field of oral history and laid the groundwork for modern documentary writing. As a centralized apparatus, it attempted to decentralize identity, cultivating the idea that it can be articulated within, not despite, a multiplicity of experiences. And this effort of fair representation and democratization and kind of the fragmented construction of identity are so normal to us now in the digital age that it's hard to think of them as novel or as a kind of innovative way of approaching history and social struggles. And this is what I was so struck by after I finished my first book, which was entirely about the literature of that followed. I wanted to see if others like me in other disciplines were thinking about the FWP's relevance to today and its legacies and successes and failures. And what kind of work was being done in the archives. And I had no idea what I would find. As I said, there wasn't that much work at the time to draw on, and an editor was interested, and he didn't know what there would be out there. But proposals started coming in, and I saw some angles I had really never considered, and I thought, okay, this is true. This is more research is happening. And as I was assembling this volume, something else happened where in 2021, of course, the pandemic, Ted Lieu of California, who hit the mother of Ted Lieu's press secretary, yes, is here today speaking. So that was a funny connection. So she can, hopefully I'll make this contact, because he actually put a bill in Congress calling for a new bill, a new federal writers project to, quote, help address the massive unemployment of writers and to create a, quote, repository that archives the stories of America's history. So there's actually a bill in Congress calling for a new federal writers project. Whether that's possible or doable or even necessary, I'm not sure, but it's a wonderful effort. And we began to see a lot of articles appearing in the summer of the same year. As Donna mentioned, there was a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on the Federal Writers Project that brought together faculty and graduate students and scholars. And 2 books came out. Scott Borschitz's Republic of Detours the same year, and Jason Boog's The Deep End, the literary scene of the Great Depression. So the collection that I had put together, I really set out to get people talking about the FWP again, actually ended up contributing to this conversation that was well underway by that point. So I just want to tell you a little bit about what's in the book. It is the first multidisciplinary retrospective of the program, and it features 11 essays from international scholars from the US, but also Japan, Germany, and Australia. And some of them are the leading scholars in this little field of the Federal Writers Project, including Gerald Hirsch, Sue DeMasi, David Taylor, and Deborah Mutnick, but also emerging scholars in the fields of history, literature, sociology, film studies, African American studies, and archival studies. And I'll just give you a little rundown of what kinds of new work is being done. We're bringing contemporary eyes to this. There's an examination of the American Guide series, specifically the early challenges the FWP faced as it transformed the series into from a set of encyclopedias to a much wider series of historical, cultural, and sociological studies. Sue DeMasi looks at Henry Alsberg, as I mentioned, who is the guiding star of the Writers Project. He was targeted for being gay and accused of being a communist spy, and he battled conservative lawmakers and radical factions within the FWP and all the enemies of FDR, and most notably the House Committee on Un-American Activities. We also have studies of individual authors. Deborah Mutnick writes about Richard Wright, who was one of the project's most famous writers, and whose association with it, along with the John Reed Club, the Southside Writers Group in Chicago, and the Communist Party, the League of American Writers, really forged, she argues, his literary imagination. Kathy King, a scholar from Germany, writes about how the FWP nurtured the creative scene in Chicago, and in particular was a source of inspiration for Margaret Walker. A Japanese scholar, Maiko Mine, looks at how Ernest Gaines, who was not a federal writer, by the way, but who came later, but he made extensive use of the former slave narratives in constructing his famous novel, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Gerald Hirsch looks at experiments in creative writing in the living lore units that Benjamin Botkin, who was the head of the folklore unit, created in the spring of 1938, turning oral folklore into kind of a new form of literature. He looks at a close reading of an unpublished manuscript, and by the way, there are so many unpublished manuscripts that we hoping to get out there. One called Chase the White Horse, which portrays children's lore in New York City and was based on the memories, observations, and interviews of federal writers. Diana Noreen Rivera looks at how the FWP documented Hispano communities of the U.S. Southwest, thanks especially to Aurora Lucero White, who served as one of the few Hispanic women in a field of over 100 workers in New Mexico. And among her many accomplishments, she was, for the FWP, was a volume of corridos, which are musical folk ballads that she collected, which challenged the kind of picturesque local color misconceptions of northern New Mexican Hispano communities. Greg Robinson and James Sung, who were also at the symposium, they look at 2 unheralded but noteworthy Asian American federal writers, which I'd never seen work like this before. finding these voices of Eddie Shimano and Gerald Shang Sig, who became, notable writers in their following the Federal Writers Project, but they look at their experience on the Writers Project and how it really influenced their careers. The book also looks at how the Writers Project impacted the identities of different communities. Rachel Harris looks specifically at how the guidebooks really influenced New Orleans and kind of helped establish the culture of New Orleans, and still exists in the walking tours that are done in the French Quarter. Oh, okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, I gotta shut up here. Anyway, then there's film studies, there's everything. My own essay is about research into children's rhymes that Ralph Ellison collected, and I include images of transcripts. If we were doing PowerPoint, I would show you some of these wonderful transcripts. And I talk about the whole concept of the rhyme itself, and this idea that Ellison uses the rhyme, which appears all over his work, as a counter language to challenge the grown-up world, because they're children, but also to challenge the structures of oppression in society. So that's it in a nutshell, and the project was itself kind of this collaboration and polyphony of voices, and in the same spirit, the collection presents this cross-disciplinary viewpoints. So you can see there's a range of work, but by the time the volume came out, the academic, political, and cultural climate had changed yet again, and it has quickly become evident that one volume, I believe, only scratches the surface. So what I'm working on now is creating a series on the Federal Writers Project that is intended to serve as a scholarly home for interdisciplinary work, and it would, I hope, offer an anchor for original work and inspiration for new research, but also to publish some of these unpublished manuscripts, and also for teachable resources, so to bring the FWP into the classroom. So there are tons of themes and work that I know is out there in so many forms, including pedagogy. Let me just say, though, that there are some challenges, logistical, of course, to creating a series, but there are also some theoretical challenges that I find really interesting, in part because the FWP seems on its surface like this narrow topic, and whether it merits a real field of study. And I understand this, of course, because it is about one government program that only existed for a handful of years. But I actually think a really useful comparison can be found in the Harlem Renaissance, where few of us would argue today that it is about one neighborhood from the 1920s. We know that its reach is very vast then and now, and I think the same could be said about the Federal Writers Project. Research into any aspect of the program has tended to be siloed, but the project marked this intersection of so many forces on race, politics, government, of course, literature, oral history, and you can't really speak about one without speaking about the other. On the other hand, anyone proposing a series on the Harlem Renaissance would have a vast body of scholarship behind them, which is not true of the Federal Writers Project at this point. The second challenge falls on the question, what can this material really tell us about now? What can all of this very old material, how is it relevant? And this is critical because while we might see striking parallels to today's cultural and political climate, they, I don't think, alone can explain why the work of the FWP continues to be so valuable. So I just want to say, do I have any time? Or are we done? I mean, I can talk about it in a Q&A too, but I just wanted to mention the work of Alessandro Portelli, who's this oral historian who spoke last week, who's not an American, he's Italian, but he's done a lot of his research, a lot of his oral history here. He also was an admirer of FDR and of the Writers Project. And he's probably done more than anyone else to theorize and defend the field of oral history globally. So he sees oral history and literature as interwoven, and treats oral history, and this is very interesting to me, as a literary genre. And he's interested in the transcription of voice and the issues around rendering dialect and the process of othering that historians are victims to. And part of his brilliance lies in how he confronts rather than defends against charges that oral history produces inaccuracies. He takes this idea of misremembering or remembering differently as really important to the story and the way we edit and make sense of our pasts and construct our identities. Memory, he writes, is not just a mirror of what has happened. It is one of the things that happens which merits study. So he believes the fidelity to facts and attention to subjectivity are not mutually exclusive. And he calls our attention to the relationship between the narrator and the interviewer. There's a lot more that could be said about him, but I'll just end by saying that what he has said about the Writers' Project in particular. And he said these are documents of the 1930s and about the 1930s, but what they also point to is the ongoing role of oral history, which is one of resistance, to show that the non-hegemonic classes are consciously active and present always in contemporary history, to show the presence, the intelligence, the political vision of the marginalized. They are political subjects, not just victims. Oppression, he said, is dehumanizing, but our shape as humans comes from fighting it. And this is what oral history and the literature that emerges from it does. Of course, it humanizes us. And I will just end by saying that what began over a decade ago for me as kind of a curious link between the project's fieldwork and post-war literature has turned into something much more expansive, something that asks us to consider how history is told within, of course, and outside of academia, and how the construction of American identity is a battle, and one that I hope this series, if it happens, can contribute to, not only by reaching back, but also really thinking forward. So that's what I'll end on. And I'm obviously, any questions, but I'm not sure how much we know about the Federal Rights Project. Yes?
I thought your talk was very interesting, but also I wonder if it was rather narrow and academic, because I heard no comparison to some of the other projects that intersected with the Federal Writers Project.
You mean theater, music, and
especially
art?
The Federal Art Project,
Mm-hmm.
and where there were interesting parallels in terms of depicting America, the Foreign Security Administration.
Yes, the photographs, of course.
Who supplied many of the photographs for the state guides.
Absolutely.
Wealthy, better known
Absolutely.
as a writer, for example, took pictures for the Mississippi guide.
That's right.
So I think that's a deficit. I think that the structure you have given us today is very narrowly constrained by academic analysis, and that when you're looking at the New Deal, you need to look at the intersection among the various programs. And the Federal Arts Project, for example, also has a directive of depicting the American scene.
Absolutely.
But when you read the state guides, and I've been collecting them for years, and the city guides, which you didn't mention, city guides, specialized guides, and the fact that the state guides have been reprinted in the last 20 years in paperback to make them available, which says something about their popularity.
Right.
That you absolutely, in addition to your academic analysis about oral history and literary fiction and so forth, that you have to connect it with the rest of the
Of course. And I just had a couple things. I appreciate that. And there's no question those intersections are vital. And in fact, they're in the collection, there's a wonderful essay about the guides and the history of the guides and the challenges of the guides. So, I as an editor, am interested. I mean, I come from my own as you say, narrow perspective. All my research was on the Federal Writers Project. I didn't do research on it's not that I don't know about those projects, and of course they had a huge impact, and they were all, they were all interrelated. But what I was interested with this volume is very much what you're talking about, is to move away from my narrow lens and to invite scholars from other disciplines and historians and journalists to consider all these other parts of the Federal Writers Project. So yes, I agree, but there's so much to talk about with this project, as you point out. But I'm just trying to kind of think about why we need to talk about it, and that was why the impetus doing the volume in the first place and inviting these other lenses and the cultural and political climate that we're going through. So I'm just trying to kind of put it into context. But you are right, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much that I could say. Yeah.
Maybe one more question or two?
Yes?
You said there was a lot that wasn't published. Who decided what was published and what wasn't?
Well, it's a great question, because I think what ended up happening is they had a lot of plans that they couldn't, the project was shut down in 43 at first, but it went on till, 41, and then it went on in various forms till 43. But they had planned to publish a lot more than they did. So it depended on, how far projects were along, what kind of pushback they were getting from Congress. They were, as I said, Henry Ellsberg was fighting a lot of battles at the time. So money was, like some of the slave narratives were published in Virginia, in Georgia, but not elsewhere until 1972. So it was really serendipity, or it was, bad luck, what would be published and what wouldn't. And that's what's so exciting and rich about these archives, is that there's so much that you're like, why wasn't this? It is, there's no rhyme or reason necessarily.
The war.
Yeah.
The war shut down.
Yes, well, of course. Right.
So in some cases, and I believe this is true for the writers project, that the people who had been involved then went on to work in war-related activities.
Right.
Like some of the federal archives artists went on to work in war-related activities, publications, camouflage painting, things like that. But that really hit. The years of productivity got shut down.
Well, the war shut down everything, right, the whole.
Well, Sarah's going to be down.
Thank you.